Hey friends, I've got a special episode of the FlowCast for you today. This is part of the season on recovery, and in this episode, we're talking about workplace recovery from burnout. And I'm sharing with you a presentation that I did for the Peterborough County, and this presentation was all about managing workplace burnout and fatigue. And so it's perfect to fit right into the topic of this season of the FlowCast. So I'm going to jump right into it. If you're listening on whatever podcast player you like to listen on, you may also find it helpful to watch this on YouTube because of the slides that I'll be sharing there. And so don't forget to subscribe on YouTube for the video version. This was the practice run of the presentation that I did the day before, and I think it went really well. They didn't happen to record the video or audio of the presentation itself, so I'm glad that I had this backup and that I'm able to share it now with you guys as well. So let's get right into it. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome. And today we are going into a topic that I think becomes more and more relevant each and every season as it passes. And we'll get into some of the history of how I got here. But we're talking about workplace burnout and fatigue, particularly recognizing it in yourself and in others. And most importantly, we're going to get into some of the strategies and tactics that we can use in order to become what I like to call unstressable, meaning we're in a state where we know that stress is going to come up in our lives, but we have the tools, we have the strategies, and we know how to recognize stress in ourselves so that we never face burnout again. And first off, a little bit about who I am. My name is RJ Kaiser. I have competed in strongman for the past 12 years now, including two fourth place finishes at Canada's Natural Strongest Man. And I'm also the founder and leader at Flow Spa here in Peterborough. When with that role, I like to say that I help people find flow and spend more time in a peak state so that they can ultimately live a life full of meaning. And we'll get into why that's relevant to stress and burnout in a little bit. But I just like to share this so that you can kind of see how I've studied as well as applied and also walked the walk as far as performing at a high level and knowing what stress can do and the importance of recovery there. So today, what we're going to get into is talking about what is burnout and is it even real, and ways that we can measure stress, looking at the deep health model to understand all the different ways stress impacts our health and our life. We're going to talk about breaking that stress chain and then get into some of the strategies and overarching themes of the strategies we can use, like reversing productivity, becoming a corporate athlete, and what that means, and fulfillment through full engagement in our work. So, workplace burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress and leads to reduced productivity, job dissatisfaction, and health problems. What we really want to do is learn how to recognize this in yourself and others to prevent burnout, as well as to promote overall that well being in the workplace. And it's important to know this too, because burnout can lead to a decreased sense of accomplishment and a loss of personal identity. But is it even a real thing? Burnout, and if you do any searching on news articles about burnout and stress or workplace burnout, there's a lot of differing opinions. And ultimately, you may come to see a lot of people talking about how is burnout a real thing? Well, last year I went to a health symposium where one of the topics that I was particularly interested in, because at Flow Spa, and if you're not familiar, we are a wellness center with float therapy and other treatments that really our clientele are stressed out people who are looking to relax and recover because they want to feel their best and perform their best. And so I was particularly interested, having seen how stress impacts so many of our clients and how approaching that line they are, this topic of burnout that was presented by Dr. Michael Militic, who he works with a lot of high performers and Olympic athletes in particular as a neuroscientist, studying their performance and their declines in performance. And ultimately, the summary of that presentation comes out to talking about stress being this important state of too muchness. And we need stress in our life because it moves us forward. When we reach this state of burnout, which is a real thing from the research that he's done, it's a state of depletion and we have nothing left to give. And this starts in the central nervous system, which means that there are real neurochemical effects that we can use to see the onset of burnout. Now, I have a 15-minute video on YouTube talking about what I learned from this presentation on the biomarkers of burnout. It's a little bit in depth and more detailed than we need to go into for the purposes of this talk today. So you can check that out. I'll make sure that these slides are shared so you can access and just click on the link. But what we really can learn and take from this research on burnout is how we can measure stress subjectively or objectively to predict burnout. Subjective measurements mean those things that we kind of feel intuitively and that self awareness around it. So when we're measuring something subjectively, it's more about how it feels. And so we can use like a tracker or a graph to measure our stress levels. And that's what you see here. Kind of this idea of each day just drawing a box or keeping it on, a note card or in a notebook, on some graph paper, on your phone or anything. Score your daily stress on a scale from 1 to 10. And so often what I see when I'm working with clients or just in general, we can start to get predictable patterns in our stress levels, which is going to lead us into clues on how we can utilize the strategies we're going to talk about to be more effective. But, if we're looking at our Canadian calendar with Sundays being the first day of the week, we see stress is quite low, not a whole lot going on. And it's a chance to sort of relax and recover. And then Monday hits and stress might jump up a bit. Nobody likes Tuesdays, so we've got even higher levels of stress on Tuesday. It kind of tapers off a little bit, but then Friday there was a deadline in our work. We had to get something big done, and so maximum stress on that day. And then we see it kind of lingering effects as it goes into the weekend. And we can use these sorts of ideas on qualitative effects of stress in our life to start to get one picture of it. Now, I like to take it a step further and look at quantitative data with things like measuring stress levels with heart rate variability, because this has reliably been shown to be one of the most accurate indicators of the trends of your stress levels. And heart rate variability, we often think of our heart rate as this sort of metronomic rhythm, say 60 beats per minute, so we can predict or we know that one beat every second. But in reality, there's actually beat to beat variations there. It's not actually every second we're getting a heartbeat, but the first one could be 97 milliseconds, next one 103 milliseconds, and so on. So what this comes to show us and what it's important to take away is it's an indicator of our stress levels. When our heart is very consistent on that every second beat, for example, it's a sign that our stress levels are higher. When there's more variability, it's a sign that our parasympathetic, or that rest and digest relaxation mode of our central nervous system, is able to engage. And over time, as chronic stress continues on, what happens is that we see that heart rate variability start to drop. That number drops because it's a sign that we're in this chronic stress state. And so, what's important to look at, the key here is trends, because we can use tools at home like Apple Watches or Aura Rings, Whoop bands, anything that tracks your heart rate, like a Fitbit even, usually now has the ability to look at heart rate variability data. And what I've found, you definitely don't want to compare two different devices, whether it's differences in their algorithms or just the accuracy of them. It'll just confuse you. So stick to one if you are going to look at these numbers and not just look at subjectively your stress trends, and look at those trends. So rather than looking at what it tells you every hour on the hour or within each day, look at what those weekly trends are and start to tie them in with something like a subjective tracker of how you feel and the stress score you give yourself at the end of the day or first thing in the morning when you look back on the previous day. So, where is all this stress coming from in this burnout? Well, having studied a lot on stress, recovery, sleep, and performance, the most comprehensive look at our health that I have found is with the 6 elements of deep health. And this deep health model looks and suggests that there are essentially 6 different domains that our health fall into. We've got physical health, which is where most of us tend to think by default. A lot of people I talk to are often surprised to hear that there's more than just physical stress and there's those other symptoms. Once you see this, it starts to make sense, because it's also important to know with the strategies that come into play with each of these being different. We've got emotional health, we've got mental health, which is actually different from emotional health. There's environmental health, our existential, or sometimes known as spiritual health, and then relational or social health. Now, looking at these and where stressors come into play with each of them, there are lots that we can think of in each of these dimensions. We'll kind of focus in on the workplace related ones, but if you've got a lot of physical activity and physical movement in the job that you're doing, there's a lot of nervous system stress going on as well. Our immune system can be compromised, and that's physical stressor. I think you guys recently had a presentation on nutrition, or it's coming up. And so maybe you've learned about some of the different ways that nutrition can stress our bodies when it's out of balance. So things like eating too many processed foods or undernourishing yourself for the demands of work or the demands of your life in general, micronutrient deficiencies. And then things like injury and surgery are another way that physical stressors impact our health. Mental stressors look like the stress of processing and interpreting information, our need to make decisions, channeling our attention, and also mitigating different distractions, and behavior regulation. So, a lot of these come into play in the workplace. And just an example, like we'll talk about this in some of the interventions and strategies we can use, but just staring at a screen all day long is a lot of mental fatigue. But we've constantly got different devices with notifications going on. All of those different distractions and those forces on our attention are why we leave the workplace at the end of the day feeling so drained and just worn out and unable to do anything. Emotional stressors, it's important to know that emotions are behavior blueprints. They are the things that, even though we want to think and we like to think that our logical brain makes most of the decisions for us, it's often those behavior blueprints caused by emotions. And whether they're positive or negative in valence, any intense emotion can cause distress because we maybe can't process them. We can't fully recognize or describe what's going on with those intense emotions. Maybe we're unable to share them, or we're blocked from dealing with them. often when we've got competing demands, kids and workplaces and everything else going on, sometimes when those high emotions are in our lives, or we're dealing with something, we're delayed from with them, and it just continues to persist. And this often ties in with existential stressors. And of course, with all of these different dimensions of health, there's a lot of overlap. They tie together. And it's important to know that too, because we don't see these as isolated forms of stress, but we look at what is going on overall. And that's known as the allostatic load on our system. And often, as we see, as we go through our adulthood and more comes as far as opportunities, experiences, there's also often more stressors coming with that too. So, existential stress is thinking about our place in the world. And it can come from not feeling enough control or certainty, and also from feeling too much freedom. So there's an important need to balance things out with our existential stressors, and I think a lot of us saw a lot of this come into play with the pandemic and those that sense of loss, grief and mortality. Sometimes it's from identity transitions, whether it's moving into a new job role, changing out of a job role, going into retirement. And also, we face existential stress when we come face to face with humanity's dark side. Now, social stress is another important one to know about because human brains are uniquely attuned to social threats. I like to say, a natural disaster just happens, but rejection is felt personally. And social stressors aren't just about one person being nasty to another. It can also be caused by the structures and systems that are in place. And so we can often see this in the workplace, whether it's unconscious or conscious that. And so it's important to know this so that we can, again, take action and help others with managing these forms of stress and also the burnout that can come with it. Because also it's important to know that the most resilient people tend to have the most robust support systems in place. So that doesn't always mean having the most people, but checking in and knowing that people have that close connection support system that they can go to when they need to. And then finally, environmental stress. Another one that can come into play with the workplaces as well. It can be a part of sort of ergonomics and the design, or whether we have access to green space, which, fantastic that there's the park right ahead of the building here. So we do have sometimes these more natural environments around, but there's layers to the environment, and it's important to understand what's going on around you as a way to break the chain of stress, which we'll talk about here shortly. So, looking at the layers of the environment, it starts with how our body is feeling, even those physical stressors there, but what's on our body. So, things like uncomfortable clothing, our phone or our wristwatch, if it's causing stress by buzzing or vibrating, that's also coming into play as our environment being stressful. What's in the room or what's within our reach that could be causing our stress. And then the place, so the workplace, the neighborhood around the workplace, and then community, state, and world. And it's important to know that as it kind of gets further away from our body in proximity, it also gets further away in what we have or don't have control over. So, when we look at all these different stressors and the importance of knowing that all these different dimensions come into play at any given time in our lives, what we see is our bodies and our physiological systems have adapted to handle stress in short bouts as a way to then promote growth. The growth equation is known as stress plus rest, or recovery here, equals growth. So we can see that with a stressor, Think going to the gym and doing a workout on a specific muscle group. If you give yourself enough recovery time, which is different for every individual, but we can start to understand our own needs by looking at things like HRV and how our stress trends are changing. When we give ourselves enough recovery time, we actually reorder and grow and adapt to a new baseline level of performance over time. But when we don't give ourselves enough recovery time, or those stressors come too frequently, is when we start to see diminishing performance. And that is what chronic stress is. And that's that state that leads to depletion, ultimately to burnout. So when we look at all these different stressors and the causes of workplace stressors, we see things like work overload and long hours causing mental stress and physical stress, lack of control over job and responsibilities being an emotional stressor, as well as an environmental stressor, and then insufficient support from management or colleagues is another social stressor there, as well as one that can lead us to feeling a loss of purpose, or struggling to also have that emotional stress under control. So we can see that all of these can and do come into play when we start to experience workplace burnout. Not that they're always in any one situation, but it's important to know these and each person's individual sensitivity to stressors so that we can share and apply these strategies to combating burnout. Because a little bit of research I did just to kind of put the point forward and send it home on what the costs of stress in the workplace look like is that 80% of workers say they experience stress on the job, and half of these say they need help learning how to manage stress, which is what we're here for today. 54% of working days lost in the UK are now caused by stress, depression, and anxiety. And I think that this pretty much extends to the whole world. I'm confident that it definitely extends to what we experience in Canada as far as working days lost. And if we look at what the World Health Organization has said in terms of lost productivity, it equals out to $1 trillion annually cost to the global economy due to stress related disorders. So let's try to talk about what we can do to break out of that burnout and become unstressable. It starts, in my mind, with breaking the chain. Breaking the chain is an activity we do in health coaching to bring awareness to stress related behaviors primarily, and do it a lot with nutrition coaching clients and also any type of health coaching clients, because building that self awareness is how we start to help ourselves as well as others in preventing burnout and managing workplace fatigue. And breaking the chain looks like figuring out what's happening in those times that lead up to those periods of too muchness. So remember, looking at the example of what sort of a week of stress scores looks like, and seeing that Friday with that deadline coming up is where stress peaks at its absolute highest. We can see things like what's happening in the hours before we start to reach those high states of stress, what's happening on those weekly trends as well as annual cycles. Where in September it's cold and flu season coming up and back to school. It kind of is this perfect storm of that annual cycle of higher stress with kids going back to school and having to balance all of those, juggling all of the extra responsibility there, as well as maybe being physically stressed on your immune system with a cold or an oncoming cold, and then the demands, maybe the annual cycle coming up at the end of the year, and the stress that kind of adds in mentally there too. So you can check in, you can work on doing the break the chain activity yourself as well if you're interested in seeing how it works. But it's essentially asking yourself those questions on what happens in the hours before you identify as being in like a higher stress state, and then what's happening in the weeks and the years, so that we can start to repeat the cycle of building self awareness is one of the keys to being able to care for ourselves better, and that's self care. So, these strategies that we're going to be talking about are about setting healthier boundaries with work and our recovery time or our leisure time, prioritizing that self care by taking breaks, asking for help when needed. And really, it's about forming an open communication about stress in the workplace. And the first strategy and tactic we're going to get into, the theme here is on reversing productivity. I like the idea of reverse productivity because we always have more tasks on our to do list than we can possibly get done. And if you start by building out your calendar, if you like to schedule things out, or if you look at your work week and it's a rather consistent and predictable schedule, basically, if we just give ourselves slots and block in time for work tasks, we could fill it all up completely. But if we start by reversing productivity and focusing on a session of active recovery sometime during the week, then that time is kind of sacred and becomes something that's blocked off for us to focus on, including more of that cycle of work, performance, and then recovery. So we want to start thinking about active recovery, which is getting us back to baseline quicker. And just jump ahead when we look at the sort of that recovery phase after a stressor. Active recovery allows us to shrink that recovery phase because what it does is it more actively engages our rest and digest system than passive recovery does. And the perfect example of passive recovery, which is actually rather stressful on our system, is watching TV. And it's so easy to plop on the couch after the end of a long workday and just binge watch your favorite show. But then how often does that end up compounding into more stress in your life, like not getting enough sleep, being stimulated by the show you're watching? And so our nervous system fires a lot from watching TV. It's not a very recovery promoting activity, even though the sort of laziness of it and just unplugging your brain, or it feels like unplugging your brain. And I love watching TV too, but I like to be aware that active recovery needs to be scheduled first so that I can enjoy that TV time or whatever show I'm watching while still not just reaching a state of burnout quicker. So that's taking into account some of the away from work hours and what we're doing for active recovery when we're away from work. What can we also do throughout the day? You know, by incorporating more active recovery, maybe it's paying attention to posture, and if you're working at a desk a lot, are you able to get up from your desk or notice how you're sitting in the desk and then move around or break connection? See, when we're constantly staring at a computer screen or working very focused on something directly in front of us and our visual system is dialed in at that same distance all day long, that actually causes more mental fatigue than almost anything else does. And so there's that mental stress of just staring at screens and kind of being bombarded by the screen. So, something like having your water bottle that's not huge, like one of those 2 liter things that gives you the count, like this one does every couple of hours, as how much water you've had, but something that's reasonable that you can finish within a span of a task or an hour. so that you're forced to get up, go to the bathroom, maybe refill your water, and then get back to work, gives you a chance to break that visual connection with what you're so focused in on. And that can really help to cut down a lot on some of the feelings of mental stress when we get home and you feel like your eyes are burning out of your head. And so active recovery should be viewed as critical as work is the first rule of reversing productivity. Now, the next one is the effortless rule. And what the effortless rule is, from author Greg McKeown, is only do today what you can recover from by tomorrow. Meant to be used as a rule in work so that we never reach a state of being burnt out. Now, I think that it's important to add on to this that we want to stick to this as much as possible so that we can break it when we need to, because realistically, we have deadlines at work and there are things that we have to do that don't always allow us to follow the effortless rule all the time. But the more that we can stick to it allows us to have that buffer of recovery for when we do need to break it. Next is becoming a corporate athlete. And the first thing we want to think about here is staying out of that zone of crap. And the definition of this is an endless cycle of low grade anxiety and distracted busyness without resolution or relief. What we often see is whether it's, that mindlessly scrolling through social media when we get a 5-minute break at work, or when we're at home and we're trying to distract ourselves from the fatigue and stress that we're facing with watching TV or multitasking and also going through social media while watching TV, is this endless cycle of this distracted busyness without resolution or relief. When we look at peak performers, they tend to have the highest highs and lowest lows. What we mean by that is that they're able to get into that active recovery state and actively disengage from everything to really promote that recovery and reduce stress. And because they do this, they're also able to kick it into the higher gear when they need to. And I have the picture of the gi here as a story of how I like to illustrate this with one of the early Gracies who brought Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the US and to mixed martial arts like UFC, was known for being asleep in the bleachers at these competitions, these fights that he was at, and somebody would come over and tap him on the shoulder, and he'd kind of slowly wake up and limber up and do a stretch and then move on over to the ring and immediately kick into high gear and beat his opponent and then go back and fall back asleep in the bleachers until his next fight. And it just goes to illustrate this point on how peak performers able to kick it into that higher gear because they prioritize that recovery as well. So the solution here is we also can take this inspiration to become corporate athletes and also to understand the stress mindset. Stress mindset is looking at what's in your control. Just like we saw with the layers of the environment around us, the further away from our physical body we get, the less and less control we have over this. And researchers suggest that there's really only 4 things that we have complete control over, which are our thoughts, our attitudes, our actions, and our efforts. And when we keep in mind what we have control over and start to let go of more of what's not in our control, that's how we start to harness the stress mindset and not let things eat away at us when they aren't going to we're not going to be able to see any resolution by focusing in and just creating more mental and emotional stress from it. This is like hugging a cactus. if you think about those things, and if we're constantly thinking about those things that we don't have control over, it's just prickling us back. And so, what we want to do is let go of more of what's not in our control and focus in on those things that are in our control. And then the other part of being a corporate athlete is recognizing that professional sports have a grueling season, but they also get an off season. And we even see, just like those research, just like the studies on burnout and more modern examples, the NFL season just started, and it's pretty cool to see that we can actually look at some of the stress levels of athletes these days with things like their sponsorships from Whoop that shows their performance and their recovery scores decline over the course of the season and going into the Super Bowl. And there's a neat article particularly with Patrick Mahomes and this whole experience and phenomena of what's going on. And they they see and they kind of know and anticipate that they're going to start to decline performance. That's where the smart athletes start to also strategize how they're mitigating their stressors going into the final months of the competitive season, because they're also going to get an off season, which, in our corporate settings, it's not like we get these long off seasons with no stressors. It's kind of like just running a marathon. And instead of crossing the finish line, we're handed another bib to start all over again. And so keeping that in mind is how we start to recognize and get inspired to include more of a rhythm of active recovery in our integration of work and life, rather than kind of banking it all for this non-existent off season. Now, some people are popularizing the idea of taking sabbaticals and time off from work, and that certainly is one strategy that can be used. But I think even in spite of that, if we want to continue to grow and adapt to the stressors around us anyway, and not just hide away from them for a season, we need to include this active recovery and know and be aware of how we can evolve to handle those stressors. And one more thing that I want to mention with this too is that I like talking about sort of athletes and performance because we get inspired by them. And if we look at somebody like LeBron James, he spends $1 million a year on active recovery practices on his body, like things like massage therapy, float tanks, Normatec recovery, hot and cold contrast, cryotherapy, all these different things that he does. Spends $1 million a year. And that's not to sticker shock you on the cost of it all, but thinking about how affordable these are within our guilt-free spending, what we've got that we can spend on active recovery, or knowing that active recovery has a lot of options that are completely free, whether it's going and doing yoga in the park or watching a yoga video on YouTube, just going and getting in nature for a walk, all these different things, spending more time outside in the sun or connecting with friends and just going for a walk. All these things are different ways that we can include more of that active recovery to integrate our work in our life. And in our cognitive sport of business, one of the best things we can do to find more balance is physical activity. I find that even if we are physically active, causing that physical stress with the work that we're doing, there's a difference, and there's so much that we adapt to more of like a exercise routine training that allows us to handle those stressors so much better. And it's important to know this too. I used to move furniture every summer for my uncle's company to pay for school. And even though I was working 12, 14 hours a day moving furniture, mind you, this is also at an age where you can handle that and then also go to the gym and still adapt and recover, we have to be mindful of where we are in our life and experience. I feel like that would probably just run me down now. But there was a difference, and I felt there was a difference in the type of training that you do with physical activity in the gym. And it doesn't have to be intense CrossFit workouts or anything like that or heavy lifting, but the physical movement I find is very important to keep us more in balance. And I talk about behavioral activation energy here. It's important to know that we kind of need a kickstart, especially if it's at the end of the day. You're not able to go to the gym and get that early win first thing in the morning, or you're not able to get outside before the sun comes up, or the family's got to get ready for school and work and all of that. So when it's the end of the day, and we would much rather plop down in front of the TV and just watch Netflix, it just takes a split second to know that action needs to come before that motivation. And we have to get over that initial little hurdle in order to start moving. And even if you do like a small win, it could be a lot of people like to do the trick on, oh, I'm just going to drive to the gym and put my shoes on. And if I want to turn around and go home, that's okay. Once you're there, you usually are able to convince yourself to stay, and you feel so much better afterwards. You're able to dump a lot of that emotional or mental stress, reconnect with the friends at the gym, or if it's like a sports league as well. So it's important to know that and recognize that it's going to take a little bit initially to activate that energy, but once you get going, it helps so much more as one of their strategies for active recovery. And then the other theme, the final theme we're going to talk about is the power of full engagement. First off is knowing that busyness does not equal progress. We need to become fully engaged in our work, and we need to stop trying to multitask. What I find is not unreasonable in most situations to ask is to do a time block of 1 to 2 deep work sessions of 60 to 90 minutes per day. So that's a max of a couple of hours at most. And the good news here is even if it's a single bout of 60 minutes, it doesn't take the full day of being unreachable. But as we saw with those mental stressors, our attention and all those distractions is one of the things that's leading the most to feeling stress in the workplace and burnt out, because we don't know when we have a chance to focus in on our work. And we'll talk more about why that's so important to our feelings of purpose and our performance here in a minute. So, deep work is this concept. And the upper limit we see from studying so many different fields and so many different performers is about 4 hours per day. So again, it's not about being unreachable, locked away in a log cabin to write out your life's work for weeks and weeks on end. The upper limit of peak performance focus mode is about 4 hours per day. And I like this essay from Paul Graham on maker time versus manager time for knowing or seeing some of the ideas that we can implement in order to allow more of this focused deep work time in different workplaces. And one of the ideas being like no meetings Wednesday. So meetings, often totally dissolve the course of a day if we don't know when to expect a meeting coming up. And so in a lot of workplaces, they institute like a no meetings Wednesday, or certain days where you can expect meetings, certain days where there won't be meetings, so that you do have the chance to block in some of this time to focus in on work and become more fully engaged, because busyness does not equal progress. And as we saw, this amount of multitasking that we're trying to do is just leading us to more fatigue and decreases in performance. So, before we get into the final point, I just kind of want to mention, recognizing burnout in others and seeing signs and symptoms like exhaustion or mentioning more exhaustion. There's decreases in productivity, more feelings of negativity or physical symptoms like absences, as we saw. All those absences or half absences are likely caused due to stress related disorders, and physical symptoms like stomach aches and headaches. And all of this is really important to know because of a state called flow. And the flow state is where we are in the zone and we're able to feel our best and perform our best because time just disappears. We're performing at our optimal level, and it's where we see heightened levels of productivity going through the roof, as well as creativity. And in my mind, flow is going to be one of those key aspects of the future of the workplace, not only because things like disruptive technologies like AI that are just becoming so much more quick and efficient, but also because flow is one of those peak experiences that we get in our life that allows us to experience more fulfillment and meaning from what we do. The good news here is that flow is much more realistic for us when we're at work than in our leisure time because of things like that behavioral activation energy, where we tend to spend our leisure time doing those things that are most easy and don't require any effort. And flow needs focus, and flow needs a little bit of a kick to get into. So that's why we want to schedule deep work time whenever possible. And it's important to know in the workplace, we have things that already help to trigger us in those conditions that get us into flow, regardless of what task we're doing. A lot of the research on the state of flow was on people doing the standard workplace tasks, those repeatable tasks that have clear goals, tasks that give us feedback. We get more flow at work because of time restrictions. There's the end of the day or the end of the week or a deadline to get a certain task done. Usually we're within our challenge and skill and the balance of our skills in order to get into flow. That's another reason why we don't see flow at home very much, because we're reading books that don't challenge us, or we're watching TV that requires no challenge whatsoever in order to sit down and do. The reason that this ties in so much to knowing burnout and understanding stress and fatigue in the workplace is because the natural flow cycle. And what we see is to fall into flow, we go through a cycle. There's the struggle phase initially, that kick of activation energy to get into this peak state before we're actually in flow. And then there's a recovery phase that's necessary before we can repeat the cycle and go into the learning and the initial kind of like phase of figuring something new out to move to that next performance level. But recovery is important in flow because of the high cost of energy that it takes to get into this state. And it's very neurochemically expensive. So it's a peak state. We feel our best, we perform our best, but because of that, it's more depleting. So if we don't respect this natural cycle of energy in our lives and we just keep pushing, usually flow can lead to a dark state of burnout or depletion and depression as well. And that's probably why we see it so much also in professional athletes who are constantly chasing and pushing to the next level. So, to recap, what are we going to work on doing? Reversing productivity. So, schedule in that active recovery when possible. Start with a single block of time, an hour or two once per week, and see what kind of difference that makes for you, as well as what you can do at work. Then follow the effortless rule. Never do more today than you can recover from by tomorrow. Become more of a corporate athlete. Stay out of the zone of crap. Focus on what you can control and stop hugging that cactus and include more rhythm of work and life integration, because we don't always get sabbaticals and off seasons to just completely reset from. As well, become fully engaged at work. Busyness does not equal progress. We need to time block our deep work, and then we also need to find flow. So, to take action, don't wait until it's too late to address burnout. Take those breaks, prioritize that self care, communicate with your colleagues, and seek support when needed. And I suggest that you pick 1 to 2 of these strategies from the recap right now and start with the ones that are most realistic, that you're most confident that you can actually work on, and then assess their effectiveness for you and keep at it, keep it in place, and then add something new on. Or if that thing doesn't work, move on to one of the other strategies. Now, there's so much more that I'd like to go into today and we could continue on with, but we don't have time and I'd like to save a few minutes for questions. So if you want to keep learning about this, I put out a free newsletter that you can subscribe to, and I'll keep giving you more of this content that you can learn from. And I've also got like a full 6-week course, which is why there's so much more info that we can cover in. But yeah, that's all I have for you for now. Thank you.